get started. Welcome to our first session in Trobe Asia's 7-week Indonesia in Focus academic seminar series. My name is Strating. I'm the director of Trobe Asia here at Trobe University in Melbourne. And I would like to start this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay my respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who might be watching this event today. Trobe Asia is really delighted to be launching our Indonesia in Focus seminar series with this live in conversation with Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar. We will be considering Indonesia's foreign policy in a time of strategic contestation during this in conversation, and we'll also be discussing the state of Australian-Indonesian bilateral relations. Dewi is a research professor at the Research Centre for Politics at the National Research and Innovation Agency and the chair of the Board of Directors for the Habibie Centre. She has also had an illustrious career in foreign affairs, including as the former Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs to the Vice President of Indonesia. So we are really delighted to welcome you today, Professor, particularly delighted that you'll be launching our seminar series. So thank you for giving us your time. Now, before I begin with our discussion, we will have some time for audience questions at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box during the discussion. But let's get straight into it. So thinking first about Indonesia's foreign policy and its position in the world. I mean, this is a region that is becoming increasingly contested. We're seeing heightened strategic competition, particularly between the United States and the People's Republic of China. So I thought I'd begin quite broadly with thinking about what Indonesia's key foreign policy interests are, what its objectives are in coping with a contested region that is in flux.
Well, thank you, Beck. It's an honor to be invited as the first guest of this Trobe discussions about Indonesia. So I'm very happy to take part in this conversations. And then to answer your questions, what is Indonesia's priorities in this region in flux? My question would be, when is the region not in flux? So, the more the region changes, the more it stays the same. For us in Indonesia, the external environment has always been challenging. And broadly, for all government, for Indonesia, there are some, you might call permanent priorities, but different administrations have focused on other priorities as well. Clearly, the most important thing is for Indonesia itself, to ensure its own national independence, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity. Indonesia is the largest archipelagic state with many sea lanes of communications, very porous borders, and clearly, it is always very anxious that the waters do not become security threats to Indonesia, whether from traditional security threats, for example, military activities of other countries, or non-traditional security threats, because we have had terrorism, people smuggling, and as well as various non-traditional security threats like natural disasters and so on. So we have a range of issues. It's not just about geopolitics. Managing the maritime resources have become even more important for Indonesia, to ensure its economic development. But when it comes to great power competitions, this is both seen as both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because there's always a danger that big powers, external powers, would like to divide Southeast Asia. That is, if there are certain things that Southeast Asian countries do not want, is to go back in history, to the early days when different colonial powers occupied and controlled the political system and the territory and the economic relations, the external relations of different Southeast Asian countries, so that Southeast Asian countries became very divided among themselves. And that was, during the colonial period. That's a period that no Southeast Asian countries want to go back into, where Southeast Asia would become, divided and a proxy, engaged in proxy conflicts, of external powers. And during the Cold War, as you know, the region was divided ideologically as well between the capitalists and the communists, or the non-communists and the communist regions. So the most important priorities is, to ensure the peace and stability of the region, to ensure that Southeast Asia remains united, the strategic autonomy of the region, the zone of peace, freedom and neutrality, the Zopfan concept remains very important, within which the different countries can continue to grow. So the peace and stability is considered to be the prerequisite, for economic development. For Indonesia, and like for the rest of the ASEAN countries, most of the strategic concerns, most of the security concerns remain primarily from within, because for Indonesia in particular, the questions of keeping the territory together is not because of fears of external invasions, but because of separatist movements, because of regional grievances. Keeping the nations united, because there are, over 700 different ethnic groups in Indonesia. Ensuring national unity is a never-ending challenge for Indonesia. Ensuring connectivity, between the different islands, so that we can deliver not just political goods, but the economic goods, social welfare and so on. So ensuring the political stability internally, ensuring security internally is very dependent on regional stability and regional security, within which the countries could continue to grow. So for Jokowi in particular, the economic priorities is paramount. Economic diplomacy has always been stressed by Joko Widodo. So when he looks to external relations, he's much more interested in the political economic dimensions, and particularly the economic dimensions, developing the connectivity to support this idea of us, global maritime vacuum, connecting Indonesia within Indonesia as well as Indonesia with the region. And competition is good to a certain extent, because it enhances the leverage of a region or a country. When several external powers are interested, when they're competing with each other, particularly for the right to invest and so on, that improves the terms of trades, that improves the ability to get the best products. And here, when it comes to economic competition, for example, it's not between the United States and China so much as between, for example, China and Japan. Indonesia is trying to attract, major investments from both Japan and China for infrastructure. It's not been successful in trying to attract the US in investing in infrastructure. When it comes to, geopolitical issues, Indonesia has remained consistent to its foreign policy stance. It's non-alignment, it's free and active foreign policy. It engages all sides, but doesn't want any one countries to become too dominant. Now, if one were to ask, what does Indonesia want to see in the region? I would say, strategic autonomy and strategic agency. The regions, the countries in the region themselves will continue to have control over their destinies, that the region will not be used as a theater for proxy wars, and that the region, particularly, ASEAN, plays a central role in creating a regional architecture which is inclusive, i.e. all countries should be able to participate, allowing no country to dominate. So, strategic autonomy, ASEAN centrality, dynamic equilibrium, so that different external powers can counterbalance each other, giving the largest, the biggest living space for the countries to grow. So that in terms of changes in continuity, I see, more continuity in Indonesia's strategic outlook and priorities. the emphasis is, under Joko Widodo, he's very interested in infrastructure development. So Indonesia has developed very close relations with China, but also, is keen also to engage with other countries, including with the United States in this.
It's a really interesting point you make about, continuity and change, and this idea that we kind of always think that the region is in flux, and that is something that is that does continue on through different periods. But I was hoping just to ask you a bit about the question of strategic autonomy. This is something that you mentioned a few times, and I think that there's a concern among some within the international relations community. That even though Southeast Asian states would like to maintain strategic autonomy, and they take what is sometimes referred to as a hedging approach, that this becomes more difficult under conditions of increased strategic competition. So there's a concern that states, smaller and middle power states in the region, might feel the need to choose or pick a side, or they might feel like external powers would like them to pick a side. So I was wondering, what's your view on this? Is a hedging sort of strategy where states can remain, where states don't have to pick a side, likely to continue on? Or do you think that there is more pressure on states, Indonesia, but also Southeast Asian states more generally, to either, in the regional context, side with China or side with the United States?
Well, if there's a bit different an answer. If you look at country specific, some countries are closer to others. Even within ASEAN, this is a given. Indonesia has always been non-aligned, one of the few truly non-aligned countries in the region. When Indonesia joined, took part in creating ASEAN, Indonesia is the only non-aligned country. All of the other 4 countries, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia were all aligned to Western countries. Now that there's an ASEAN 10, interestingly, Vietnam is becoming closer to the United States because of common concerns about China. You see the Philippines flip-flops. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, but it has interesting development. At one time, under the current president, the Duterte, he got closer to China, but now, veering back, got closer to the United States. Singapore has always been very close to the United States. So country specifics, Laos and Cambodia would always be closer to China. That's a given. Vietnam would never be close to China, regardless of what the geostrategic condition is, because historically, Vietnam would always, that's the history of Vietnam, has always wanted to maintain its autonomy from its biggest, its threatening northern neighbor. So within ASEAN, the idea of aligning everybody, just following one particular external relations has never been able, it's a non-starter, because our strategic culture is very different. And that's why ASEAN could never become a defense alliance. We can never develop into a military alliance. For Indonesia, that is anathema anyway, because Indonesia is, it's a DNA, it's a free and active foreign policy, means no military alignment. But at the ASEAN level, if you look at various surveys been done at the ASEAN level, the choice has been not to pick side. So different individual ASEAN countries may have their particularistic orientations, but I think there is a general consensus that ASEAN as an entity, not necessarily neutral. I don't know what happened, lost connection there for about 1 minute.
Yes, we did lose connection, but at the time, when you dropped out, you were talking about the ASEAN. The position of ASEAN is not to choose sides, even if individual countries within the organisation do tilt one way or the other. So would you like to continue with addressing that question about hedging strategy, or Indonesia in particular? Is it going to become harder for Indonesia to maintain strategic autonomy, given the external pressures, or do you expect that this is something that it's so hard baked into Indonesia's strategic culture that it just will not be forced to choose a side?
Well, as I said, in Indonesia, we always say bebas aktif, free and active foreign policy doesn't mean neutrality and not taking a position. For Indonesia in particular, I can't say for all the other countries, it's been able to do it in a more functional way. If you look at it, who provides the most investment in which Indonesia really feel a real need, particularly now, for President Joko Widodo, is the infrastructure. The United States, Western countries are not interested in infrastructure investment because it's risky, it's long term, not clear return on investment. But countries that are interested is China and Japan. So the competition is between China and Japan here. If you remember, the competition to build the high-speed railway between Jakarta and Bandung is not between the United States and China, it's between Japan and China. Indonesia awarded the contract to China, and everybody got upset, saying Indonesia is getting very close to China. But at the same time, Indonesia awarded the contract for Jakarta-Surabaya track to Japan. So and this is the game that Indonesia has been playing since its birth. And when it comes to security, it's another matter. Indonesia's attitude towards China is still rather, they're still equivocal. There's deep-seated distrust still towards China, not just on the geopolitical side, but also in the economic side. For men on the street, the concern is not about the South China Sea. It's about the influx of Chinese imports, that manufactured imports, even batiks, that are manufactured in China and making Indonesia's own more expensive batiks less competitive. It's very difficult to find fruits which are grown in Indonesia. So for both the manufacturing sectors and the agriculture sectors are very upset about the ASEAN-China free trade. You remember at one time, when the ASEAN-China free trade came to being, there's huge demonstrations on the streets where, that people wanted that to be rescinded. And there are concerns about the influx of Chinese workers into Indonesia also, because a lot of these investments are BOT, build, operate, and transfers, and very little Indonesian workers at the at significant level, particularly the management level, would be employed, and even at the lower level, where if you are working for a Japanese company or Western companies, the expats would only be at the top levels, while at the middle to lower levels, it would be local human resources. Chinese companies are not like that. That also creates problems. So despite close connections, there are problems. So it's not all rosy, and that suspicions of China remains, and of course over the Natuna Sea issues. So when it comes to geostrategic issues, we see that Indonesia continues to develop very close military to military cooperation with the United States. In terms of procurements, Indonesia doesn't want to be too dependent on any one country anymore, because it doesn't want to be to suffer from embargoes that like what it did during the East Timor issue, for example. So it has to diversify. But recently, hold on a minute. I think my daughter is disrupting this. So sorry about that. She started to sing.
No problem at all. I like it when the children come in and make an appearance.
So recently, the Indonesian Army and the US Army carried out this largest ever joint exercise in 3 islands, in Sumatra, Java, and Kalimantan. And then the United States is helping to build this maritime training center in Batam to improve the capacity of the Indonesia's Coast Guard, So as I say, when you're talking, not choosing sides, you choose different sides for different issues. And I think that, the market is big enough for that. It will become a problem if there is a real open conflict. Then let's hope that it doesn't come to that. And that's why Indonesia as a middle power is playing this, this role as a bridge builder, facilitator, and then trying to build, a more inclusive regional architecture through ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, for example, where all countries, United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are all there. This isn't a place where we can all have conversations, and Indonesia will continue to want to do that.
Well, you mentioned Russia in that answer, and I wanted to ask you about one of the more recent events happening, global events happening, and that's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And recently Australia has advocated that Indonesia exclude Russia from the G20 meeting following the invasion of Ukraine. And in response, Indonesian representatives have pointed out that Australia invited Russia to the 2014 G8 after the annexation of Crimea. So I wanted to ask you about, this is clearly a point of tension among states in the region about how they're positioned in relation to Russia. So what is Indonesia's attitude to the Ukraine crisis been, but also in relation to Indonesia's relationship with Russia and how it sees Russia's role in the Asian region?
Well, there are a lot of questions there. Firstly, when it comes to the Russian invasion with Ukraine, Indonesia joined that over 100 countries in the General Assembly with their resolutions criticizing Russian invasion, which is considered to be violations of international law, violations of the UN Charter. So Indonesia's position is very clear there. But when it comes to the G20, Indonesia's position is that the G20 is a very important forum in its own right. And at this time of we are not fully recovered from the pandemic yet. And the agenda for the G20 is necessary, not just for the 20 countries, but also, globally, because the G20 is, the pallbearer, for various decisions that can be taken at the global level. Talking about global health architecture, about energy transition, about the digital economy, and so on. Hard decisions needed to be made by everybody, and Indonesia has been pressured by the United States, by Canada, and so on, not to invite Russia. But the Indonesian position has been, we are not in a position not to disinvite anybody. And I think that a solution has been offered that if Russia, if Putin is invited, then the Ukrainian president needs also to be invited. And I've just seen a tweet from the Ukrainian president that President Joko Widodo has actually talked to him on the phone, and that has invited him. President Joko Widodo has made very clear his support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So, Indonesia will want to ensure that G20 itself is not undermined by the crisis, but we cannot pretend that the Ukrainian crisis does not happen. It's not business as usual. And hopefully, by inviting the Ukrainian president, maybe there'll be a possibility for Indonesia to play host, a bridge building role where more constructive dialogues can be developed. But as I said, Indonesia and Australia have a lot of different positions on a number of issues. Our relations with Russia have not been that close, but Indonesia imports a lot of stuff from Russia, like phosphate, and Russia is an important market also for Indonesia's CPO. Indonesia bought some of the aircrafts from Russia. In fact, Indonesia ordered some Sukhoi from Russia, but and now it's some problems with the deals, and now Indonesia is also looking to the West, to United States. But relations with Russia is important, but the economic links remains quite minimal, but it is still important. But interestingly, and this is something that's worthy of note, the Lawi Institute talk about the fact that the majority of Indonesians are not that interested in international affairs. They are not that well informed about international affairs, but there is a very instinctive reactions against what it says as US and Western intervention and Western bullying. And if you look at various surveys, including one done by the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, the attitudes toward China and the United States at one time, particularly towards the later end year of the Trump administration, equal numbers, over 73% of Indonesians distrusted both China and the United States. And here, one has to understand that when Indonesia looks at the United States, this is not just about the Indo-Pacific region. Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. It has a very strong interest in the fates of other Islamic societies. It has committed itself since its independence, since 1948, to support the independent state of Palestine. So the position of Indonesia and the United States, where the issue of Israel and Palestine have always been diametrically opposed. The policies of the United States against Muslim societies, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya and so on, always roused anger and so on. So when people in Indonesia look at the United States, this is not just about US versus China, but also the US role in the world, particularly relations with the Muslim world. So the bottom line is, when you choose to pick sides, the fact of the matter is, all of these countries are problematic. Historically, we've had problems with all of them. So the attitude has always been, that's why we have to rely on our own national resilience. That's why we should not hitch our wagon to any one country where we could, where we would lose our autonomy. That's why, that's the essence of being an active foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you make about the nature of public opinion, and you also said that there are a lot of things historically that Australia and Indonesia have disagreed about. So I wanted to ask you now and turn our attention to the state of the bilateral relationship and get your assessment on the health of Australia and Indonesia relations at the moment.
Well, I would say that our bilateral relations have always been robust. Why is that? It's resilient. The relations, people have written about this, we are strange neighbors, less strange than before, once Indonesia has become a more democratic society, with democratic quality, we have more in common. Also, noisy press and so on, we are much more alike than others. But we are, culturally, we're very different. The strategic culture is very different. Australia is very much a US ally. It prides itself, in its alignment with the US. While to Indonesia, any alignment is anathema. So from there, that is already a major departing point. But both countries regard the bilateral relations are incredibly important. So even when we disagree on a number of issues, there is always a desire, to rebuild it. Although, it's like roller coaster, you build it up slowly and then goes down quickly. But the fact that we quarrel over so many issues is testimony of the fact that we are doing so many things together. We don't quarrel with Argentina too much, we don't quarrel with Vietnam, within ASEAN, we quarrel with Malaysia all the time because Malaysia is the closest country to us. There's the people-to-people connections with Malaysia is so intense. There are just so many points of entry for disagreements, and that's the true with the case with Australia. The people-to-people connections are both our strength and our weakness. I just saw on television the other day about the issues of Indonesian children in prison in Australia being treated as adults, and that's become a major issue in Indonesia. And why are they, why are they there? Because a lot of them go there. So there's, there is something that we have to continue to deal with. Indonesia will continue to be suspicious of Australia's intention on Papua. You can't eradicate that because it's history, Australia's role in East Timor, the independence of East Timor. A lot of Indonesians blame Australia's role for that. And then, a lot of Papuans who disagree with Indonesia seek refuge, asylums in Australia. That upsets Indonesia, and then Australian holidaymakers brought drugs to Indonesia and got jailed, and that upsets a lot of Australians, cows being sold to Indonesia and being slaughtered in a way that upsets Australians. There are just so many issues precisely because there's so many things going on between us. But at the strategic level, despite the different strategic culture, both countries have tended to be more or less on the same page. We want peaceful and stable region where every country can grow. We are committed, to a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. The different ways we do that, I don't see that as an issue, because Indonesia's way is to go the diplomatic way, the more conciliatory way, and Australia has always been part of that. Indonesia is the one that wanted to bring Australia into the East Asia Summit. Remember, in 2005, when East Asia Summit was first mooted, some countries only wanted it to be ASEAN +3. China, Japan, and South Korea. It was Indonesia who said, no, we do not want an exclusive Asian only, East Asia. So East Asia's footprint was widened, at Indonesia's insistence to include India, Australia, and New Zealand. And then, to include the United States and Russia as well. So we might call it East Asia, but in fact, it's only very much Indo-Pacific from the very beginning.
I wanted to ask you about the Indo-Pacific concept because it's quite controversial in some ways. It's a concept that Australia has enthusiastically adopted and driven in a lot of ways, but it's one that China is not quite a fan of. I think the Chinese Communist Party sees the Indo-Pacific as a kind of containment strategy, as being an anti-China strategy. You've used the term Indo-Pacific a few times in this seminar. What does Indonesia have a sort of Indo-Pacific concept that it's using? Is it similar to Australia's or is it different? I think it's an important question about how we Australia and Indonesia view the region, because Australia and Indonesia are two of the few countries that actually span across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how Indonesia views that Indo-Pacific region.
Well, like Australia, which started to use the term Indo-Pacific in its White Defense Paper 2013, Indonesia also started to introduce the subject of Indo-Pacific in 2013. So Indonesian Prime Minister Martina Talagawa, under the second term of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, actually suggested that there should be an Indo-Pacific Treaty of Friendship. And this is because, the Indonesian Prime Minister then already saw the rise of India in the increasing saliency of the Indian Ocean, so that we cannot only focus on the Asia-Pacific domain, but we need to pay more attention to the Indian Ocean as well. And Indonesia has already revitalized, the IORA as well. Under Indonesia, is the first summit of the Indian Ocean Rim Association was, hosted by Indonesia. So the concept of uniting, the two oceans into one strategic concept has already been, entertained by the Indonesian government, even during the SBY administration. Of course, the more serious approach to the Indo-Pacific region came during Jokowi's administration, when he articulated the need to make Indonesia into a global maritime fulcrum, because physically, Indonesia really straddles, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific oceans, as well as the two continents, the Asian continent, the Australian continent. But really, the focus on the maritime domain has been the hallmark of particularly the first Jokowi administrations. So Indonesia has sees the concept of Indo-Pacific very much in line with its own global maritime fulcrum concept. When the various initiatives came, then a free and open Indo-Pacific from Japan, and then the United States, with President Trump, there is this feeling that the Indo-Pacific concept was defined in a more restrictive way. The free and open Indo-Pacific is seen by some, not as by China as a containment policy, but also by the propagators of this free and open Indo-Pacific is something different from what China is doing, and that's why Indonesia has taken the lead in 2018 in promoting the concept of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And you have to note, it's an outlook. It's not it's not a strategy, not a strategy. It's not an ASEAN strategy on Indo-Pacific. It's an ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is simply to continue to use what ASEAN already has. All the ASEAN mechanisms, the ASEAN regional forums, already comprises all the South Asian countries. The East Asia Summit, has already comprised also, India. The various mechanisms, the ASEAN Plus mechanisms, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and so on, already comprise, all of the salient countries. So the point is, just use the ASEAN mechanisms, and that's, so the ASEAN centrality is the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Use the existing mechanism, but Indonesia doesn't make any comment about the Quad. That's 4 sovereign countries, 3 US allies plus a non-aligned India feel the need to get together over China. Though you notice that over Russia, India and China go together, and the BRICS also team up. Within the G20, the G7, and then BRICS. They are not necessarily all in the same, on the same page. So you can see India playing its role as well. On China, India is closer to the United States. On Russia issues, India is closer to China in their position. So for Indonesia, it's very important that the term Indo-Pacific for us is non-political, and it's not clearly defined either. There's no clear mental map where it starts. Whether it starts from the western coast of California till the eastern coast of Africa, but in practical terms, it's, the triangle: Japan to the north, Australia, New Zealand to the south, and and India to the west. So for us, this is our living space. This is the space that we have lived in, and in fact, it's only in the later part of 20th century that the Asia Pacific really matters, because before that, civilizations, trade, religions, cultures all came through the Indian Ocean, after all, as well as from the South China Sea. If you look at Indonesia, the cultural influence. Look at my name, Dewi. That's Hindu. Fortuna. That's Latin. That's from our European connections. Anwar is Arabic. And there are also there was Chinese influence as well. So for Indonesia, that confluence of different civilizations covering the 2 seas, part of our living reality, not just the geographic space, but also the economic space, the cultural space as well.
It's a really important point you make. Indo-Pacific as a term is used in a number of different ways. And it's important for us to kind of unpack what we mean by the Indo-Pacific. But I wanted to ask you one more question of my own. I can see that we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A, which is always a good sign of a stimulating conversation. But the question is about, this is something that I've wondered myself, thinking about Australia and Indonesia relations. There's a view that in Australia that Indonesia is more important to us and to our sense of regional, national and regional security than we are to Indonesia. We look north to Indonesia. Indonesia looks north to Southeast Asia and is a leader within ASEAN. So and you did touch on this before, talking about, how, for the example that you gave about Indonesian children being treated as adults when they're incarcerated. Does Australia get much of a look in when international affairs is being discussed in Indonesia? Are we considered to be important for Indonesia's Indo-Pacific outlook?
Well, of course, you're our best friend, though our relationships tend to be love and hate. But don't feel bad that, Indonesia occupies more, exercise more of the Australian minds and Australians exercise Indonesian minds, because your neighbors are the Kiwis and the Penguins. So of course, you have to look north. And if you look to China, you have to go through this, archipelagic states called Indonesia. So of course, you are, and there are so many things happening in the north, in Indonesia and through Indonesia. With Indonesia, there are so many things going on, within ASEAN. We are already, even without the external dimension, within ASEAN, we have a lot of things going on between Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, and there's Myanmar all the time, and China is always there, and then Japan is always there, North Korea, and then to the west, where we have, a lot of non-traditional security threats coming through the Indian Ocean, whether it's terrorism, whether it's people smuggling, and so on. Australia gets attentions when things go wrong, usually. When things go right, we don't pay attention too much to Australia. But when things go wrong, then, or when Australia does something that Indonesia feels does not reflect the close relations that we're supposed to have. Indonesia and Australia has signed, this framework security agreement. We are supposed to be in close communication with each other. There's a 2+2 forum between defense ministers and foreign ministers as well. But a week after the meeting in Jakarta between the two defense ministers and foreign ministers, Australia announced AUKUS in Washington, and Indonesia only heard about it from the media. And that upsets Indonesia no end. And before that, during the Martin Natagawa's time, I remember as prime minister, the posting of that US Marines in Darwin, the number is not that significant, 1,500. But the first Indonesia feels, if it has been forewarned and explained beforehand rather than explaining after Indonesia got upset, it would have been much better. After it's been explained, there's no more complaints from Indonesia. But without the explanations, when I am asked, for example, by the media, why is Australia doing this? There will be a lot of speculations. We will not be in the know. So, there's still a lot of trust that needs to be, to be built here, and there's better communication, on our sides. And usually the complainants, because Australia quite often, makes surprise movements that can upset some Indonesians. And I remember during the time of the Iraq War, when the Prime Minister Howard talked about being the deputy sheriff of the United States, and then people in Jakarta got very iffy about it. We will just talk to the sheriff, not talk to the deputy, that kind of thing. But as I said, the relations are very dynamic. We are joined at the hips. We are neighbors. But in terms of personal relations do matter. There's some personal relations are better than others. And I have to say that usually during the Labour government, more efforts are made to develop the personal rapport. The more interest in identifying Australia as part of the closer neighborhood. while during liberal government, quite often, is the connection with Washington that is more emphasized than the neighborhood. And of course, that also affects, perceptions.
Interesting. We do have an election coming up in Australia, so that might affect Australia and Indonesia bilateral relations going forward as well. But we have a number of questions, as I said, in the Q&A box that I'd like to turn to now, including one on climate change. A very important question. Indonesia is likely to be heavily impacted by climate change, including the current capital city of Jakarta, heavily impacted by climate change. So how has Australia's ongoing climate ambivalence affected the bilateral relationship with Indonesia?
Well, I have to be honest with you, this is not an area of which, I'm very, very well informed. But Indonesia has remained committed, to the Paris Agreement. But it has expressed a lot of disappointment with the Western developed countries' commitment. They promise a lot of dollars to assist Indonesia and developing countries in mitigation, for example. And the promises have not really been fulfilled. So there's been a lot of disappointment there. But Indonesia remains very committed because, as I say, without paying attention to the climate change issue, to the energy issues, besides land clearing and things like that, it's our own environment that is going to be affected. The livelihood of our farmers, and also Jakarta is slowly sinking, and that's one of the reasons put forward by President Joko Widodo, for moving the capital city out to lessen the burden of Jakarta. But there's a lot of disappointments when developed countries, particularly when Trump walked out of the Paris deal, and when the countries that are supposed to be champions, fighting for cleaner environment, but also putting their dollars where their mouth are, they're not really as committed as they were before. With Norway, for example, Indonesia had this RED Plus deal, and Indonesia revoked that because there's not been much going on in terms of realizing that commitment.
Yeah. So we have another question here about whether or not you see China's expansion into Tibet, Xinjiang, the 9-dash line, of course, in the South China Sea, and its attitudes towards Taiwan. Is this seen, in your view, as neo-colonialism?
The Indonesia, for example, there's different territories, different categories here. Taiwan, Indonesia has always adhered to one China policy from the very beginning. So Indonesia is one of the first countries to have diplomatic relations with the PRC in 1950. We already developed diplomatic relations with PRC. Even throughout the period when Indonesia froze diplomatic relations with China between 1966 to 1990. Indonesia did not develop diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So really, diplomatic relations always been with Beijing, even when it was frozen. Although now Indonesia has developed very close economic and other technical relations, including a lot of Indonesian migrant workers are working in Taiwan. And clearly a very concerned. We don't want China to carry out threatening, policies toward Taiwan, because it would destabilize the whole region. Taiwan is a very important player, economic player. It's a member of APEC, a huge Taiwan investment also in Indonesia. So while we adhere to a China policy, we also want Taiwan to continue to be a healthy, viable entity, and for the status quo to be maintained. On the South China Sea, Indonesia is not a party to the various competing claims in the Spratlys or Paracels, but for the 9-dash lines, which Indonesia does not recognize because it doesn't exist. The international law, the United Nations Convention on Rule of the Sea of 1982, does not recognize the 9-dash line. So Indonesia's position is we don't recognize it. So when China complains to Indonesia about the oil drilling in its, exclusive economic zones, which impinges on China's unilateral claims on 9 dash lines, or when Indonesia carried out bilateral exercises with military exercises with United States, China also wrote a diplomatic letter to Indonesia. Indonesia simply ignored that. And some people say, why do you ignore it? Why don't you answer? And Indonesia, we don't consider China to be a party to this. It has no role. It has no legal right. So we don't regard it as, as necessary to respond to it. And that's always been Indonesia's position to that. On Xinjiang, this is, Indonesia pays attention to the issues of human rights abuses, but not to the, to the claim. Indonesia doesn't take an issue whether China's presence is legitimate or not. And this is Indonesia also has problems with restive provinces, with different cultures, different religions, and so on. So it's very careful about not to be seen to intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries. But as fellow Muslims, there have been a lot of concerns about the treatment of the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. Not much mention about Tibet. I don't think that Indonesia has paid too much attention to that. But on the Xinjiang issues, there have been some focus on that.
So turning to, you did mention this a little earlier in our conversation. You did mention the Quad, but we do have a question in the Q&A box about Indonesia and ASEAN more broadly. What is the view on the increasing activity of the Quad in the region? Is it welcome, or does it actually detract from ASEAN centrality and autonomy? And I might actually add something to that question, because we've got Indonesia, we've got ASEAN as an institution, but then there's also ASEAN member states, because there might be diversity among the Southeast Asian states about the Quad and the activities of the Quad. So in general terms, is the Quad and its increased activities welcome in the region?
Well, I can't say for Indonesia, as I said, because Indonesia has not made any official position. There's no statement on the Quad, unlike on the submarine power deal, which Indonesia was very strongly critical about. It didn't mention about AUKUS. Indonesia complained about concerns about nuclear non-proliferations. It didn't mention anything about AUKUS itself. But on the Quad, it has not made any statement. But I think that personally, I see the Quad has a role to play, particularly as it's also moving into, not simply focusing on hard security issues. If the Quad wants to make a difference, if it wants to compete with China, then it has to be equally active in the areas where China is winning. For vaccines, for example, Indonesia is mostly imported vaccine from China. The major Indonesian vaccine from China. Why? Because it's the one most readily available. If the Quad countries have made their vaccines readily available, I'm sure Indonesia and other countries in the region would be very keen to have investment also, trades and so on. So if it's just about military activities, Indonesia will be concerned about heightening military activities of countries in Indonesian near waters. And I think that's one of the reasons for the upset with Australia. Because we control the sea lanes of communications connecting between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. You have to go through Indonesian waters. From the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, you have to go through Indonesian waters. So Indonesia will be very concerned about increased military activities in the waters surrounding its areas, let alone in its own within its own archipelagic waters. Indonesia will be very upset if all these warships are going back and forth and nuclear power submarines going back, and that will not be welcome in Indonesia.
An excellent point. I think we've got time for one more question. which just disappeared off my screen. And this is from Tess Newton-Kane. Hi, Tess. Good to see you. What can we expect in terms of the future of the Pacific elevation, and how do you see Indonesia acting within the Melanesian Spearhead Group, of which it is an associate member? Very important question given Australia's focus on the Pacific at the moment.
Very, yeah. I've been following the Solomon Islands. Yeah. I mean, from our perspective, I must say, the government of Solomon is very smart. From an area where nobody pays attention to it, and then only, as the recipient of aid from Australia and New Zealand, don't almost wholly dependent on that. It has played a very smart move. If one were to grade them in terms of the ability, this by getting China, it suddenly. Can you imagine high-level officials, high-ranking officials from the United States visiting there, from Australia? Go for them. But clearly, this is Pacific Islands going to be an area of intense competition, and this will clearly, be very areas of concern for the United States, because it will disrupt the navigations, and of course, it will be an area of concerns for Australia and New Zealand too. And I think, for all of us, we do not want to militarize the Pacifics, but for a long time, the Pacifics have been the lakes belonging to, US Pacific Command. And now it's an Indo-Pacific Command. So this is just widening an area of competition. But for Indonesia, the Pacific is becoming very important because, this Melanesian connection. So Indonesia has to pay more attention to that for domestic reasons rather than for foreign affairs reasons, for ensuring that this understanding that there are more Melanesians living in Indonesia actually than in the whole Melanesian islands, because it's not just people in Papua who are Melanesians, but people in Ambon, in Flores, and so on. They are in the Moluccas. They're also Melanesians, and Indonesia therefore, at least legitimately, also can claim to have some Melanesian legitimacy as well. The eastern part of Indonesia, after all, is Melanesian, and we need to pay attention to that, regardless of the geopolitical and geostrategic considerations.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. We do still have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm very apologetic to those who put questions in that we didn't get time to get to. But I think our audience members would agree that was an incredibly insightful and fascinating discussion. And I would really like to thank Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar for launching our Indonesia in Focus academic seminar series in 2022, and to thank our audience for tuning in and for asking such excellent questions. Please follow us on Twitter at Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find more details for online events and the Trobe Asia publications. And we have 6 more seminars coming up in our seminar series, which are going to cover a range of different issues, including environmental politics, human rights, disability politics, oral cancer care, healthcare, a range of different and diverse topics focused on Indonesia. So thank you again, Professor Anwar. It's been an absolute delight to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. And I can see the comments coming through the chat. I think our audience members really enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Latrobe. Thank you. Bye.